Hi there, and welcome to the Curious Collective podcast, conversations designed for the veteran and first responder community to bring awareness to those holistic practices that help us live our best life. So tap into the wisdom and knowledge of our guests to heal, transform, and live as your true soulful self. Now, I have with us today a guest who I have been wanting to speak to on this podcast for a very long time, and I was had the pleasure to actually spend time face to face with at the beginning of this month, which feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
Welcome, Ben Pronk, to the Curious Collective.
Katie, thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Now, this podcast is just purely conversations about who you are, what you're doing in the world, and how you got to be doing that. So, firstly, without me stuffing up your intro, I would love you to introduce yourself and what it is that you're doing in the world right now.
Awesome. So my name is Ben Pronk. I am doing a couple of things. We run a consultancy, myself and Tim Curtis, a really good friend of mine, that focuses across three broad areas. So crisis management, leadership, but resilience, which is probably the key sort of area we want to focus on. And in that last area, we work a lot with my brother, Dr. Dan Pronk. My background's in defence. I spent 24 years in the military, most of that in the special operations community, which was obviously, in hindsight, a good exposure to some of these concepts that we currently work in, but in particular, this idea of resilience. And it was, as I often reflect on it, it was, I guess, my military service that got me very interested in resilience. But interestingly, and I think for a lot of your listeners, it's probably the same. I didn't actually think much about resilience while I was in uniform. I just kind of did stuff, and we had challenges and we got through them, and we developed coping mechanisms, some probably more adaptive or better than others. But you kind of just muddle through, and then it was really towards the end of my career when we started seeing people having various issues, particularly mental health issues, PTSD, etc., as a result primarily of service in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Timor and these sorts of things,
Mm.
that I started to get really fascinated by this topic because we're all tough guys, right? You know, gender exclusive.
Mm.
We're tough guys and girls. And it didn't make sense that some people were going through these things and having no dramas. Some people actually seemed to thrive out of, exposure to trauma and stress. They just kept getting stronger. And others, however, were really having some issues. And that got us fascinated with this thing called resilience because we're all pretty physically fit. We're all pretty mentally tough to some extent. We'd had to
Mm.
demonstrate that to get into the SAS. And yet we're seeing these really different reactions. And so that was the real catalyst for me to get interested in resilience. And that's been a big driver for what we're trying to do now with the Resilience Shield.
And the resilience shield is what has got me actually loving that word again, because I don't know if you'd like to speak into this, but previously when I'd heard that word, I'd go into contraction. I'd be like, oh,
Yeah.
they're talking about resilience again. And maybe that
Yeah.
was the silly courses they'd make us do in the army that were very blanket, generic. But when I did the online mentorship training with your team and the resilience shield, I learned what resilience actually is. Can you explain it in the way that
Yeah.
you and Dan and Tim teach it, please?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is really important because it's a word that can mean a lot to a lot of different people and even a lot of different areas. I mean, you talk to a cyber expert about resilience, you'll get a very different answer in terms of what we think. The first thing is I think it's important to say what it is not. And to me, one of the uh, I think most potentially dangerous definitions of resilience is that you just keep sucking it up. It's keeping on going, stiff upper lip, that kind of, and without getting too gendered, but I think, a blokey sort of interpretation that you show no emotion, you just keep going, regardless of what life throws at you, you keep sort of going forward. Um, Now, that is an aspect of resilience. We certainly don't want to crumble every time, someone has a crossword or something doesn't go our way.
Mhm.
But it's so dangerous, I think, to think that resilience is just about sucking it up and keeping on going, because as we came to realize through our own research that no organism can keep doing that. No human can keep sucking up stress and trauma indefinitely. This stuff
Mhm.
has a toll. And there's a beautiful book, by the way, on the topic of PTSD called "The Body Keeps the Score," which is a wonderful sort of sentence to describe what happens with stress. We do want to be able to deal with it, and particularly in military and first response jobs where extraordinary trauma and exposure to extraordinary events is kind of expected. That's table stakes for your role. We need to be able to keep going through some of that, but the really important caveat and the second bit of any mature definition of resilience is this recognition that we also need to be able to kind of bounce back. We also need to be able to recognize that stress will have an impact, and we need to incorporate practices in our lives that can help mitigate that impact while we're still in the role. But also, if we do have a stress related illness or injury, be able to help get us back. And so those two definitions, keeping going, sure, but keeping going the recognition that at some point this will take a toll and we need to have active measures to try to mitigate that.
Heck yes, I love that. And that what has brought in this resilient shield concept that through your research and your combined knowledge and the traversing through creation of it that you've done is this multi-layered approach and
Yeah.
all the different layers. So are you able to, with me, maybe we can talk into some of those layers to give
Yeah,
people a
awesome.
bit of an overview of it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I love to talk first about the first layer. For me was my favorite because it's that innate layer, the one that's
Yeah.
like your blueprint in life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this was a really important one for us, and it's one that we probably didn't recognize how important it was. But the innate layer is kind of, I like that term, that blueprint. It is a bit nature, a bit nurture. So there's a little bit of genetics in there, different people, and there's a research that supports this. Our different DNA, different genetic makeups can either predispose us to be more or less resilient. There are different sort of constituents in terms of our neurology, in terms of our individual blueprints, as you said, that can have a bearing on baseline resilience. So that's the first bit. The second bit is the nurture, the epigenetics, how those genes have expressed themselves, largely attributable to the environment in which we've been raised. And
Mm.
so this is another massive differentiator between individuals. How much stress were you exposed to as a toddler, or importantly, as an adolescent, when you're going through these big neuroplastic changes? Your brain
Mm.
is changing and forming the adult that you'll later become. Some really interesting research out of University of Queensland shows that people who have no trauma or stress in their teen, you think the helicopter snowplow parents have cleared
Mm.
the way, the trust funds paid for everything, no issues. This sounds like a wonderful sort of way to exist, but it means that you probably aren't developing some of those coping skills that will later set you up. Conversely, people who have gone through what they call ELS, early lifehood stressors,
Mm.
but have had coping, supportive families or developed coping mechanisms or have had the ability to work through that, they've actually got physically different brains. They are in a better position to deal with stress as an adult. And tragically, people who have gone through early lifehood stress in these formative stages but haven't had supportive mechanisms,
Mm.
they haven't. The damage has remained in many
Mm.
ways. And so you get this vast variation by the time you reach adulthood. This really significant differences between individuals. And so the kind of key upshot we talk about this innate layer, there's not much you can do to change it.
Mm.
You can certainly do some reframing. So there's a lot of psychological practices that look at reframing post-trauma,
Yeah.
cognitive behavioral therapy being a big one there. But it is about understanding it. And in particular, it's about recognizing that people are going to have different start points. And
Mm.
this was not something I think my particular cohort did well in the military. We'd go through a trauma, maybe a battlefield exposure or some kind of situation, and we'd sort of look around and we'd sort of think, I'm doing okay, but Steve-O there in the corners in bits, must be something wrong with him, or probably
Mm.
more commonly, we'd look around and everyone else seemed to be doing okay, noting we're only seeing the surface, but everyone else
Oh, and
seems to be fine.
ourself, we weren't
And we're
com
thinking, I'm a bit rattled. There's something wrong with me. It's not
mm.
an apples for apples comparison. There's some wonderful analogies. The psychiatrists and psychologists use. One, I like this idea of deal with stress or trauma, and everyone's bucket's a different size, by the way. This is that
Mm,
innate layer bit. But, we fill this bucket with exposure, even if subjectively. And we see this a lot in the first response community that I imagine, I've never been through it, and I'm in awe of people who do, but I imagine the first time you go to a domestic violence situation in a policing context or a vehicle accident involving children
mm,
in a fire or paramedic context, that must be incredibly subjectively traumatic. It must
yeah.
rattle you. But obviously, these amazing folk develop these coping skills to deal with that, such that by the 10th or 15th time you go to one of these, subjectively, you're much better, you're in control, you're dealing with that stress. But the body is keeping the score.
Yeah.
It's filling your bucket. And if you haven't got these active mechanisms or practices to try to drain that bucket, eventually it overflows. And what we see quite often is that, it can often be a very relatively minuscule stressor that overflows the bucket.
Mm,
It's that
mm.
literal straw that breaks the camel's back, and people uh, sort of have this massive overreaction or a stress reaction brought on by something that in itself may not be huge, but it's that cumulative
Yeah.
effect.
And then they don't understand why it's happened either. It's like, hey, I've done this 1,000 times. Why is this one time? You
Yeah.
know?
And this has been a big thing for us, like writ large with the whole mental health thing. I think there's traditionally, and hopefully it's getting better, but there's been stigma and taboo and a lack of understanding about this stuff. And what we hope our model brings, and what it certainly brought for us, is a better understanding and a better
Mm,
awareness.
mm.
And so when you talk about things like, mindfulness, meditation, gratitude, impacts of stress, all that sort of stuff. It When you understand the mechanism, it kind of makes a lot more sense. And
Yeah.
for me, it makes it a lot easier to deal with. The analogy I always use, in the SAS regiment, we'd maintain a high level of physical fitness. And if you got a hamstring twinge or rolled an ankle, you'd be straight to the physio. You'd go straight on a rehab program. You'd do your rehab, you'd work,
Mm,
you'd be out of work for a little while, you'd work to get back up, and you'd come back in. And yet if there was a mental health equivalent of that, people would just keep running on it. It's
yeah.
the equivalent of running on a rolled ankle or a sprained ankle or a torn hamstring. You wouldn't do that in a physical sense, and yet
Mm. We
a
all
lot of
do,
people, we all do. Yeah, yeah,
or
and
did
so
before the awareness piece.
correct, and so that better awareness, I think, can help rationalize it a bit more and make it a little
Yeah.
less kind of maybe scary or taboo.
Yeah, I love that. And I absolutely love that bucket analogy you used before. I think that's
Mhm.
brilliant. I'm definitely going to do a post on that.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's a beautiful segue as well, this awareness piece into the mind layer.
yeah,
And for me, I loved learning about the mind layer with you and the team,
yeah,
especially when we're in that face to face up at Mount Tambourine.
yeah,
And we had a beautiful meditation teacher come in and teach us a style of meditation that I had never personally tried before. So
yeah.
there's Mike, so many components, but I would love to hear you speak into that mind layer with us.
Well, this I think is the biggest area in general that people in general, but I'd probably say, um, very dynamic people like first responders, ex-military, this kind of uh, sort of cohort. I think we're leaving money on the table here.
Mm,
I think there is a perception, and it's one that I held very firmly for many years, that this stuff is just woo-woo. It is fluffy. And so, the mind layer, we break it down to things, to two key areas. One is mindset. So the way you frame things, the way you interpret the information and uh, sort of data that's getting presented to you every day, that's mindset. And the second one is your ability to focus, which in many ways is the domain of mindfulness and meditation.
mm.
All of those sort of things, I think, have a bad PR problem. People tend to think, oh, yeah, think happy thoughts. That sounds nice, useless. Oh, yeah, let's meditate or let's express gratitude. Fluffy bullshit, not gonna help. And certainly I was of that opinion across the board with most of the stuff we talk about in the mind layer, right up until two things. One, I started looking at the research, or we collectively started looking at the research behind these practices, and that is incredibly compelling.
Mm.
It really takes it out of this fluffy woo-woo, get your crystals out sort of domain and puts it into just straight hard tax neuroscience.
Mm.
And the second thing that really turned me is actually starting to try doing these things, getting over myself, maybe my egos and my little buddy insecurities or whatever, and trying these practices, not as a fluffy feel good thing, but as, and we use this word deliberately, as a tool.
Mm.
This is something like, going to the gym or going for a run as a tool to develop physical health. These are things that are tools that can be used to develop mental health. And
Mm.
just like, going to the gym or going for a run or going for a swim or going cycling, there's a wide range of these things that are going to appeal differently to different people.
Yeah.
So too with some of the mind layer interventions. There's a whole bunch of different things that, we really encourage people to muck around with. Do those what we call N=1 experiments. Do
Yeah.
experiments on yourself to see what works.
Yeah, I love that. And that's why I call my whole community and all that I do the Curious Collective, because really with the mind layer, it is about getting curious and it is about exploring those things. And there was one part of mine that I loved the most when I was with you guys at Tambourine, and that was that amygdala hijack. Are you able to
Yeah,
talk into that a little? Because that is a
yeah.
fascinating piece.
Well, this was massive for our understanding, particularly of how the mind layer interventions work. And it comes back to this idea that our brains are about 250 or 300,000 years old. So Homo sapiens kind of has been around that long, and our brains haven't actually evolved that much in that period. It's not a long sort of period in terms of evolutionary processes.
Mm.
And so that first thing to understand is that our brains are kind of optimized for a very, very different environment. And this was an environment where things like physical threats were prevalent. And
Mm.
the main function of our brain ultimately is to keep us alive. And so that means finding something to eat, avoiding being something to eat, finding somewhere warm to sleep, finding someone to mate with, these kind of base
Mm.
level Maslow's hierarchy, primal sort of existential needs. And so when you look at it through that lens, one of the most powerful functions of our brain is to respond to things that are going to threaten our life. So a saber-toothed tiger jumping out or extreme cold or things like that, our brain has a very effective, albeit primal sort of response mechanism, which is largely driven by your amygdala. These two little almond-shaped chunks. Amygdala apparently means almond in Latin or
Oh,
Greek or something.
wow. There you
And
go.
yeah, and so they're in the base of your brain, and they respond. They have an impact on your autonomic nervous system. So they trigger what's called the sympathetic state of your autonomic nervous
Mm.
system. We know better as the fight or flight response. And so these things are designed to leap into action super quick, and they tend to drive things like increased heart rate, increased breathing, increased
Mm.
sweating. Your mind tends to focus just on the threat, so you may get things like tunnel vision, auditory exclusion. You certainly have impacts on things like memory creation or retention or recall, as well as your ability to do higher cognitive tasks. So it's
Mm.
all about just zeroing in and fighting or fleeing, punching,
Mm.
running, this kind of response. What that means, however, is that in our current day and age, a lot of the threats we face or the stressors we face, they're not going to kill us as quick as like a saber-toothed tiger jumping out. But a lot of these kind of responses are going to be quite negative. And
Mm.
so a guy called Daniel Goleman, who's done a lot of research into things like emotional intelligence and leadership writ large, but he coined the phrase amygdala hijack. And he says an amygdala hijack is what occurs is when you perceive a threat, something stresses you, your amygdala reacts as if it's a physical threat. And so you do something in the heat of the moment, generally something aggressive, something angry, something dumb,
Mm.
that you later regret.
Mm.
And so
Mm.
this is the, you know, flipping someone off in traffic or cutting someone off that ends in either a car crash or a violent altercation. It's texting angry, which ends in
Mm.
regret. It's snapping back at a loved one or a boss that ends in having to unwind that. Um, any of these kind of responses uh, where you do something in the heat of the moment that's dumb that you later regret, that's the concept behind an amygdala hijack.
Yeah, I love it so much. And it's that dropping in that awareness piece over the top of it as you
Mm,
start to unpack and develop and grow in this resilience shield practice is this whole being able to actually catch when you're going to do that,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
then use some of those tools that you've collected along the way to just actually, I mean, Dan, Dr. Dan in the book speaks about when he was having to speak
In
in a
court that, yeah,
court process, and he found his body doing these reactions, and it
yeah,
was through his awareness that happened, and he was able to just stop, do some deep diaphragmatic breathing, counting, and just bring himself back to the present moment, and he was able to get up, and speak from a more regulated place. I'm like, oh wow.
yeah. And I love that story because in typical Dan fashion, it demonstrates some vulnerability, but it reinforces, we are not immune to this. Like we work in this space all the time. I still find myself triggered. I still find myself occasionally, and hopefully less frequently, but occasionally doing dumb stuff because I'm pissed off or because I'm
Mm,
angry or scared or whatever. Um, but what I am finding is having that understanding not only gives me maybe a few more go-to tools, things that
mm,
I can do in that moment to try to avoid that negative reaction, but it also makes it less scary. A
yeah,
lot of times we feel like, oh, I'm out of control and I'm angry and this is something wrong with me, or, I should be better at this, or we get down on ourselves and it compounds that stress.
mm,
Whereas more and more with a little bit of understanding, you can develop that what they call meta awareness. It's almost like that recognition. Ah, shit, that's my amygdala going.
yeah.
I'm feeling that adrenaline. I'm getting flushed, and it's almost like this. I almost come to think of it as that's my old friend the amygdala, or
It
things like
brings you back
jealousy
to
or
your
whatever.
body. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's like, oh, okay, this isn't me being a bloody loser or whatever. This is my body having a
Mm,
reaction to what's going on.
mm. And I think these beautiful collective conversations we have as well, like humanize it, and it's the part of the process. It's like we're not
Yeah.
immune to it. This is, us traversing and learning more about ourselves and each other.
Yeah, yeah. And
Mm,
look, it's what it's how our bodies work,
mm,
and so yeah, I like that point that you said it humanizes or even normalizes it, and
mm,
it is pretty cool. We feel incredibly lucky to be in the position we're in to work with all these different groups and to be privy to conversations where people in
mm,
really stressful, first response, like I said before, and stress is stress, by the way. Like this is another thing that I think is important. We'll often get situations. I did a presentation for a group of travel industry folk and, was talking about some of this stuff. And we get this quite common thing at the end of those where people will come up and say, "Oh, this is nothing like what you've done," but
mm,
blah
mm,
blah blah. In this case, they're saying, "Oh, this is nothing like what you've done," but during 9/11, basically air travel stopped, my business stopped. I
mm,
couldn't feed my family, and all of this. We didn't know if there'd be a future, if anyone had ever traveled. I'm saying, dude, that is exactly like stress is stress. It doesn't matter if
mm,
someone's shooting at you. This is your livelihood. This is everything coming in. Your body's reacting in a very similar way. So again, that idea of comparison is really negative. That
mm.
stress is stress. It's having that similar impact regardless of the mechanism.
Absolutely. And that's a beautiful segue into body. Now, the body layer
Yeah.
and how that stress, if it's collecting over time and time and time and time, and there is no
Yeah.
awareness piece coming into it, what that's actually doing within the body, and some of the ways to shift that. I'd love to hear about the body layer with you.
The body layer is a funny one because we get up and say that the body layer is about sleep, diet, and exercise. They're the three pillars in our model of the body layer. And you get almost this collective eye roll. It's like, no shit. Like, yeah, thanks. That's great. Got my money's worth out of this session. But when you look at that through the lens of, I guess, resilience and stress, it is very interesting that the first three things we tend to ditch when life starts to get stressful is our sleep, diet, and our exercise.
Mm,
And having this understanding, the blatantly obvious fact that those three things help, but looking at them not just as kind of these nice to haves that we do when we've got a bit of time, but as these really active pillars of our resilience that we want to fight to keep in our lives, particularly when we're stressed.
mm,
That can sometimes change that paradigm. And so this idea of particularly sleep, which is the most predominant, it's kind of the MVP out of those three. Um, I think trying to change that attitude, which certainly pervaded in the military, and I think maybe is getting better, but this idea that sleep's a bit of an indulgence, sleep's a bit for the lazy or the weak. And,
Oh,
us tough people, people that brag in the military context, oh, I've only had 4 hours sleep for the last 3 nights, and look how tough I am. I'm
that's
going above and beyond.
crazy.
It's a dumb thing to be proud of. Like, not only because, like, long term, that's essentially a carcinogen. It's been causally
Mm,
linked to so many nasty diseases and impacts on your recovery and all that sort of stuff. But in the short term, just that impact on performance. A study we often like to quote out of the US in about 2022, I think it was, showed that surgeons performing minor surgical tasks did a better job when they were drunk than if they'd been awake for 16 hours.
yeah,
It's a
wow.
performance inhibitor. So
Mm,
if you're bragging about the fact you've been running on vapors in terms of your sleep, that's a dumb thing to be proud of.
mm, mm. And in turn, it's same with the food. It's like, remember the old
Yeah.
eating's cheating saying?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
exactly.
like being able to fuel the body. Like, I know we all enjoy a cup of coffee, but some people just live off that. Start the day with
Yeah.
a coffee and then wonder why their anxiety's through the roof. It's
Yeah,
like,
and then they can't get to sleep and yeah, all those other sort of impacts.
and they all, I think, with all of the layers of the shield, they all tie into each other. Like that affects the mind, which affects the genes, which affects the, you know,
Beautiful point. Yeah, and that's a really important point that none of these layers are independent. In fact, they're very interdependent in terms of how they operate.
and
But
the you.
oh, sorry, I was just going to say sleep's a really cool one because it's one that increasingly we're able to sort of track and we're able to experiment with. Like a
Mm,
lot of people now are using different devices, smartwatches or wearables and that sort of stuff, which gives you, my personal view is that none of them are particularly accurate. There's issues with the algorithms and all that sort of stuff, but they are consistently inaccurate. And so what
mm,
they can give you is a good idea of trends and a good idea of the impacts of different behaviors. Some in particular, we really like Whoops. And I was going to say this is not a paid promotion. Whoop, if you're listening, I'd be happy to accept a sponsorship deal. But and I think they're all variations on a theme, these sort of trackers. But Whoop has a journal sort of function. So what it means is every morning you do a quick tick and flick saying, last night, did you drink caffeine and at what point?
mm,
Or did you have blue light? Or did you drink alcohol? Or did you do exercise? It's
mm,
this quick tick and flick with a whole variety of fields you can tailor. And so what this means is you can do these little experiments to work out what sort of interventions are moving the needle. And for me, a really great example is blue light blocking glasses.
mm.
There's some mixed literature in terms of the science on this, but like with all the science, I mean, they work on population averages or the cohort that they've got. They're not perfect. You need to test it on yourself. And I found that the blue light blocking glasses had a marked improvement on my recovery score and my sleep. And so
Mm.
that was an interesting little one where I was able to do that experiment and recognize, yeah, this works. Same with magnesium. That was another thing.
Oh yeah, so
Is it
good.
is it worth paying money for magnesium? I don't
Mm,
know. And so having that data was really useful, but you can also do it in a qualitative sense. Just
yeah.
track. Okay, I have been using magnesium. Yeah, I wake up feeling better, or I had longer just time in bed or time asleep. So
Mm,
that sort of thing, I think, can also be useful for people who might be a bit cynical about this stuff. You know,
yeah.
try it and log it, treat it like an experiment.
Absolutely. And there's that curiosity layer coming back in, is like
Yep.
experimenting with yourself. And it brings us beautifully into the next layer, which is the social layer. If we
Mm,
are doing these things and trying these things for ourselves, like sharing these with our mates and those close to us of
yep.
what we're trying, what we're doing, how that's going for us is I think part of the social layer is having these conversations. But I'd love to
Absolutely.
hear more about how you and the team have constructed that social layer.
Yep. So the social layer is all about the resilience you get from your interactions with other humans around you. Now, this can include people in your workplace, but it also needs to recognize that a lot of times, when we leave a job, we kind of leave that environment. And if we're over invested in our friendships, and this is probably the case with a lot of military and first
Mm.
response. I don't think I'd met a civilian. I certainly didn't have any civilian friends until I was bloody 44 years old and getting out of the military. And turns out civvies are okay as a sort of an aside. There are some
Tick.
good ones. Yeah, yeah. But what tends to happen is if you leave the job, it keeps going on without you. And it's not
Mm.
that the people don't like you anymore or any of that sort of stuff, but a lot of these are just really busy jobs. A lot of it is demanding on people's time, and when you step off that freight train, you can find yourself sort of a bit isolated. So a lot of what we're talking about with the social layer are those through life relationships, things like intimate partners, spouses, family, all
Mm.
that sort of stuff, or friends outside of work. Um, and a lot of this, exactly as you said, Katie, it's this idea of being able to be authentic and vulnerable with people, to talk and
Mm.
normalize and that sort of stuff, and to have that support to sort of help you make
Mm.
sense of different situations and potentially traumas.
Yeah, I'm really interested too in like as you start to evolve and change and
Mm.
perhaps heal some of the things that you or develop more tools within your resilience shield is like the friendships that you used to have may sort of transform and go into
Yeah,
different groups and you kind of are your environment and who you spend your time with. So
yeah.
I'd love to hear your take on that, like perhaps staying around those that aren't necessarily helping you to find yourself.
Yeah, there's some really interesting, I guess, both anecdotal stories, but also research around this. Tim tells a wonderful story in the book, the Resilient Shield book, about a mate of his that, he sort of ended up doing some kind of audit and recognizing that every time they went out or caught up, it'd end up in a million beers and he'd feel pretty lousy afterwards. He wasn't
Mm.
getting a lot out of it. And so he deliberately sort of pared back on that relationship, still stays in touch with this person, but it, they get what they need out of each other without being a negative thing. But the biggest sort of study into this is a byproduct of a thing called the Grant study or the Harvard study of adult development, which has been going since about 1938. So there's massive longitudinal study about how humans thrive, and it looks at
Mm.
health, but also physical health, but also mental health across this massive cohort. And number one with a bullet in terms of the thing that helps humans be happy and healthy into old age is quality of relationships.
Mm.
And there's a really interesting one of the co-directors of the in fact I think it's the current co-directors of the study wrote a book. Um, uh, I think it's called The Good Life, Bob Waldinger. Anyway, but they talk about doing this thing they call the social universe activity. And it asks you to draw up a little two by two graph with sort of frequency of interaction with people and positivity of interaction with people,
Mm.
and then to plot the 10 people closest to you on that graph. And
Oh,
so the idea
interesting.
is that maybe, I don't know, you've got a boss that really grinds your gear or whatever. So unfortunately, you're seeing them every day. So high frequency but low
Mm.
positivity. Um, Conversely, and this is probably very common for a lot of us, you might have someone who just absolutely fills your cup, this wonderful person, but you just never find the time to spend
Mm.
with them. So high positivity, low frequency. And so the idea is you plot all these people that are currently sort of the 10 closest people to you, and you then put an arrow as to where you want them to be. So your boss is high frequency, maybe high frequency, but low positivity. We can't really reduce the frequency unless you want to quit your job, and maybe
Mm.
that's an option. But maybe you've got to look at, well, how can I change that positivity? So again, this comes back to the mind layer and things like mindset and reframing. Your boss is going to be a dick.
Yeah.
They're going to trigger you. They're going to come at you with the passive aggressive stuff.
Mm.
And one of the most beautiful ways to counter this is to reflect back to Marcus Aurelius, one of the Roman Stoics. So in the first century AD,
Mm.
this guy was the emperor of Rome. And a lot of what we know about him is from a book that they now call Meditations, but it was actually his journals. This is one beautiful entry. He's running Rome, right? He's basically ruler of most of the known world at that stage. And he's writing this one morning, the people I meet today are going to be ungrateful, they're going to be unsociable, they're going to be nasty. He's priming himself that
Mm.
I'm going to meet all these dicks today. I know it. And yet I'm not going to let them trigger me because, they've got their own stuff going on. I'm
Mm.
better than that. I'm preparing myself. So it's this beautiful, timeless passage. It's equally applicable in modern day office politics.
Yeah, I love that.
That, okay, I know my boss is going to trigger me. I can't get away from it or whoever,
Mm.
but I'm going to be better than that. I'm going to be
Yeah.
ready for it. I'm going to deal with it appropriately. I'm not going to let that amygdala hijack creep in. I'm going to use go-to tools. I'm not going to bite, all that
Mm.
sort of stuff. And, in many ways, it can become this challenge. I think you develop a level of empathy, or certainly I do. I genuinely believe that there are very few people in the world who deliberately try to be assholes. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
most people are expressing this because they've got their own stuff going on or their own insecurities or whatever.
Yeah, I
And
agree
so
with that.
that level of empathy helps. But also it becomes this kind of challenge for me to be a better person. And the Stoics
Mm.
talk a lot about this. But okay, I'm going to rise above this. I'm going to work through it. Not in a superior, as in better than
Yeah,
you, but as a better than I was before. I'm
yeah.
not going to let this have this negative effect on me.
And coming back to that, we've always got choice.
Yeah.
That piece is like you get to choose. It actually always comes back to you being able to
Yeah.
choose. But yeah, I
Which,
think,
which Katie, sorry, I want to say that as well, because a lot of times people say that you've got the choice and people think, oh, that's a cop out or whatever.
mm,
I think it's really empowering.
it
I
is.
think it's recognizing that, well, there are these things you can do, these tools you can use, these mindsets you can adopt that actually move the needle, that actually have a difference. Now, these are little 1% changes in your life, but
Mm,
they accumulate and they do give you that sense or an increased sense of agency. So it's not just, I don't have a choice. I've got to do this job because I need the money and my boss is a dick. It's like, well, okay, those things may all be true, but I still have a choice as to how I'm going to
mm.
approach this.
And you guys always talk into it is always that little bit further. So if you're not
Yeah.
catching yourself in that moment and you did the thing, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, I did the thing. Use that as self-reflection and go, the next time this happens, perhaps I won't do the thing because I'm more
Yeah.
aware this time and I do have
Yeah.
that choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of this comes back to one of those big pillars in the mind layer, this idea of locus of control. Where do we see the control resting? And the typical sort of victimhood mentality is it's very external. Like,
Mm,
my boss is a dick, this situation sucks, started raining, all these sorts of things. And that's a very disempowering sort of perspective, and it's
mm,
not good from a mental health perspective. And there's lots of studies. A guy called Julian Rotter who sort of developed this, and some of his associates have done longitudinal studies of people who exhibit this kind of characteristic. They don't have good lives. They're not happy. They're not
mm,
fulfilled.
mm.
Whereas other folk who that same, you know, nasty stuff can happen, but they have that choice and it is more empowering. It gives them more agency.
Yeah, completely. That is one of my favorite parts of Mind Layer as well. And
Yeah,
one more book to drop while we're in social layer is there's a book called Lost Connections by Johan Hari. And
yeah,
he's a British guy, and it's so good. It's about he's actually gone over to Germany where the war was in, and he's studying actual interactions between people and how having deeper interaction and opening conversation can change your mental health. So that's a really. Have you read
yeah.
that one, Ben?
I haven't, but I've heard of it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
such a good book. And that talking about workplaces and bosses, and that moves us into the next layer, which is our professional layer. Did you want to
yeah.
tell us about that one?
Yeah, so this is in our lexicon, our model, the resilience you get from what you do on a day-to-day basis. So, for a lot of people, that will be your work, but we always put the caveat that it may not be. So, for obviously people at uni, it's going to be your studies. For people post-career, it's how you fill your day. That might be volunteer
Mm,
work, it might be socializing, whatever. Um, but it all comes down to these two key sort of pillars. The first one is this idea of what we call virtuosity. So it's how good you are at that thing you fill your day with.
mhm,
Now, this isn't to imply that you need to be a virtuoso. You don't need to be the world's best, ambo fiery police officer, whatever your job is. But you need to feel you have the capability to deal with whatever your job's going to throw at you.
mm,
We sort of like to say it pretty evident, It's kind of hard to be resilient if you feel you suck at your job. You know, you want to have those tools to deal with what your day-to-day is going to throw at you. So that's the virtuosity bit. But the second bit is purpose. You need to
Mm,
find some kind of meaning from a resilience perspective in terms of what you're doing. And
mm,
so, you know, if you are studying something because you believe it's going to fulfill you or increase your ability to help other people or to make a difference in the world, you know, that's a good example of purpose. Um, we have very little sort of dramas conveying this for people in first response or military type
yeah.
jobs. It's rare people join these kind of organizations because they like the sexy uniform or the massive paycheck. You know, people join these things for a sense of service, for a sense of
Mm,
purpose. But it's funny in other vocations, particularly I guess ones that you know a big part of the attraction is financial remuneration. Um, Often that purpose isn't there in
mm,
as great an extent, and so that can be an area of reflection as well. So yeah, virtuosity, competence, capability, as well as purpose, finding meaning in what you're doing are the two big
mm.
pillars of that professional layer.
Yeah, I love that. I'd also love to pose to you that when people do transition from these jobs that give them that identity or that purpose externally, is like I feel as well like you are your own purpose at times. It's like coming back to intrinsically like what
Yeah,
it is that you are here to do for you as you.
yep, yep, yep. And this is a massive one, I think.
Oh.
Um, And this is a massive one, I think, for military and probably to a large extent first response organizations. You know, we come back to that innate layer where we develop a big chunk of our identity in that period of adolescence. So from a neuroplastic perspective, our brain change perspective, this is where we as humans are working out who we are as distinct from our family. So that
Mm,
real independence, who am I as a human? We often see things like risk-taking behavior in boys and social sort of stratification in girls. That sort of stuff is us trying to work out who we are as an independent human. If you overlay that period, which extends well into your 20s,
mm,
if we overlay that period with a military indoctrination, you know, we join the military, you know, militaries are great at taking a very disparate group of people and slamming them together and giving them a collective identity and instinctive obedience and
mm,
allegiance, all that sort of stuff. Um, then in many ways, that's programming people's identity that, okay, well, I know who I am. I'm a soldier, sailor,
mm,
or aviator, or police officer, or fiery, or paramedic, or whatever. So you get that, what they call role identity fusion, where people see their identity, who they are, as their role,
mm,
what they do. And that's great while you're in service and it works really well. You've got that purpose, you're helping others, queen and country or king and country or whatever it is now. Um, but it can be a big readjustment when you get out because all
mm,
of a sudden you no longer have that purpose through your work, through the professional layer. But you've also got this identity hooked up in being that person in uniform or that role. And so
mm.
I think this understanding is important that people need to do that reinvention. They need to recognize who they are independent from that role. Now,
Mm.
I will go to my grave being incredibly proud and thankful for my military service. That's a big part of who I am, but it ain't all of who I am. And I
Yeah.
think that's a big thing that it took me a while to get my head around. And I think maybe the same with other ex first response and military.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be scary. It can be this rediscovery phase. I like the analogy of like, your life's a book and that was that chapter and we're flicked
Yeah.
and the pages are blank and you now get to write or recreate that for yourself. So
Yeah.
yeah, not too scary.
No, in fact, it's super exciting, but there is a bit for me, there was a bit of ego tied up in it. And, you know, I sort of use this joke that, you know, by the end of my career, my last job, I was commanding officer of the Special Air Service Regiment. I'd spent my entire time in Special Operations Command. I was very special, you know, and then you sort of come out and I was just a civvy, you know, within
Yeah.
not just a civvy, that sounded awful, but you know, I didn't have this status and this
Mm,
rank and, you know, I wasn't wearing medals and pips and all sorts of stuff anymore. And um, yeah, I'd never thought that stuff was that important to me, but it is part
mm,
of your identity, and I think, like I said, as long as it's not all of your identity, you're probably
yeah.
in a good spot.
Yeah, and again, awareness and getting curious. So
Yeah,
I'd love to move on to the last layer of the ship, which is the adaptation layer.
yeah. Well, this one really came out because certainly from our research and our statistical analysis, there was a bit of a ghost in the machine in that all those bits, the sort of innate mind, body, social, and professional, didn't add up to the whole of what we are seeing from resilience. And so there was this missing sort of factor. And in many ways, it's this what they call this gestalt effect, where the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. And so there's that aspect that these things put together, even though they're individual mechanisms and they operate, they're interdependent, but they do contribute independently to resilience. We need to look at all of the different layers. But there is something else that once you string them all together, you get that increased effect. But it's also recognizing the transferability of
Mm,
resilience techniques. So if you can develop good practices in those known environments, you've got good physical sleep, diet, and exercise practices, you've got good mental techniques, you've got good social relationship, you've got purpose and fulfillment and virtuosity in your job,
mm,
it gives you the ability to transfer that resilience to unforeseen challenges,
mm,
to novel or unprecedented events. And so we see, and in fact, a lot of the work, a lady called Angela Duckworth, who wrote a book, Grit, she talks a lot about this idea
mm,
of grit, um, cites a lot of the studies of the transferability of resilience. If you've
mm,
demonstrated resilience through maybe a military boot camp or a difficult childhood situation, you're probably in a better position to stick with, or to work through a challenging period in a relationship or to work through a difficult
mm.
phase in a job. There is that transferability of those skills. And so that idea of adaptation is recognizing that if we can develop these practices in our day-to-day life, it sets us up for the unforeseen, for the zombie
Yeah.
apocalypse, whatever's coming at us.
How good is that? It's also what I'm seeing as well is this like integration of the layers is then
Yeah.
going out into everyday life and you really don't know what you're going to interact with in each
Yeah.
and every day is like being able to ride those waves or be able to be that tree in the forest that the storm's coming and you're like I'm good.
Yeah, yeah. And it's without being too Pollyanna, it also kind of changes your identity, I think. It shifts you away from that victimhood, anything could happen to me at any stage and it could knock me for six, to more of a position where, yeah, anything could happen at any stage.
Mm.
Spoiler alert, that's called life. But, maybe I've got some tools and I'm the kind of person who's going to rise and work through it rather than fall in a heap.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I think it can end up to be this point where you you're not wishing for for tragedy to descend on you, but you're certainly in a better position.
Mm.
You're not sort of, I guess, cowering and hoping the wind doesn't blow. You're in a better position to deal with stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Your feet are on the ground. So I know that I came and did the Resilient Shield mentorship training with you and the team, and I absolutely loved it. And part of that is now I get to do this beautiful work that you
Yeah,
guys have
yeah.
created together with others. So I wanted to just share with the listeners about the survey and then connecting
Yeah,
back with me. Are you able to talk just into what that survey does for
sure.
people and encourage them to maybe give it a go?
Sure. So the Resilience Survey, which is available on our website, resilientshield.com, it's a free and confidential tool that we've created. The genesis of this was kind of twofold. The first was we wanted some kind of, I guess, quantifiable metric to give people an indication of where they stood on this. So we recognised very early in the piece that resilience was multifactorial. There were these
Mm,
different layers, as we came to call them, at play within resilience. And what we were seeing was that a lot of the resilience products out there were generally focusing on one of these or another. And so, you might get a book or a workshop or whatever that says that meditation is great for resilience. And we couldn't agree more. But if you're a Buddhist monk and you're already meditating 10 hours a day or whatever, if you've got that squared away, then that advice is not going to be that helpful for you.
mm,
And likewise, physical fitness is really good, but if you're an ultra distance triathlete or something, again, you're probably good in that area. And so we wanted an ability for people to recognize where they're going to get the most bang for their buck. So to
mm,
really individualize their understanding of their own resilience, and also the things that they could be doing in the limited time we've all got available to
Yeah.
maximize the benefits. So that was the first thing. Second thing, it was very important to us as a research tool. So it allowed us to have a look at how those different layers, our hypothesis based on our initial research was that there were these 6 layers of resilience. And the survey allowed us to sort of measure these and to try to work out how they were contributing across the board to overall resilience and indeed whether they were.
Mm.
And as it turned out, they were. Each of the 4 modifiable layers, mind, body, social, and professional, contribute independently and statistically significantly to overall resilience. So it reassured us that, yeah, these things are discrete, they're separate things, and they're worth investing in across the board.
Mm.
And so we've sort of had a number of iterations of the survey. We've now got over 30,000 responses to us,
Yeah,
which gives
wow,
us
that's
a
decent.
massive, yeah, it's good. And it's a good data set for our research. But it also means that when participants complete the survey, they'll get a report, and that gives them an idea of where they stand relative to those other 30,000. Now, a massive, massive caveat here, we wrestled long and hard with how we presented these results. And we ended up going with that representation against the wider data set, to give some idea in terms of a bell curve of where someone sits.
Mm.
But this is an individual, qualitative, subjective, self-reported survey. People can game it, people can do all sorts of things. There is noise in the data in that respect. So we really encourage people not to think about the actual numbers. It doesn't actually matter where you
Mm.
sit against the rest of the world, but what we want people to look at is the relative difference in their own layers. So,
Yeah.
if you get your results back and you get, I don't know, 80% in social layer, 60% in professional layer, 10% in body layer and 20% in mind layer. That's starting to give you a bit of an idea and to start this discussion and this curiosity, that beautiful
Mm.
word you use
Mm.
in your collective, is to, okay, well, tide looks a bit out on my body and my
Mm.
mind. What could this mean? And yeah, okay, I don't sleep that well. Maybe that's something I can look at
Mm.
prioritizing. Or yeah, well, mindfulness, I've never done that in my life. Maybe that's something that I could look at trying. So it's really designed to not be a diagnostic, not be an absolute, number sort of prognosis, but be a conversation starter,
Mm.
give people some idea of where they might want to focus their efforts.
Yeah, and it gives you the ability to chat with someone that has looked through all these different layers,
Yeah,
to
yeah,
give you the mentorship around what might work for you, what might not work for you, what you've heard about, what you've tried, what you haven't tried. So,
absolutely.
yeah, happy to have
Yeah.
those conversations. And everything Ben's just spoke about with regards to that survey, I'll stick into the comments as well. So, my closing question to you, Ben, is for those curious about the Resilience Shield and the work that you and Dan and Tim do, what advice do you have for them if they're peeping in and having a look?
Well, certainly that first thing about curiosity, again, it is such a beautiful word. So the first bit is stay curious,
Mm.
have that thirst for understanding how these different things could work and approach a lot of them with that open, curious mind,
Yeah.
rather than a cynical sort of fixed mind. The second thing is absolutely our website's a good place to start if you're interested in this specific model. Resilientshield.com. There's a sort of overview there. There's links to the survey. There's a number of resources, and likewise all of the sort of model and particularly the genesis and some of the research behind it's explained more fully in the book, which is also available at sort of a lot of bookstores around Australia, as well as through our website, as well as Audible and Kindle. You can get the audio book if you're not sick of hearing my voice by the end of this podcast. Then yeah, Tim,
It's a
Dan, and I
great audiobook.
have. Thank you. Tim certainly stars in terms of a much more entertaining. His chapters are far more orally pleasant than mine and Dan's strain. But yeah, so all those things that would be the next thing that for a deeper dive. The book's got a lot more information.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time today, all of what you've shared. I could talk to you all day long. Like I love the conversations, and I
Yeah,
loved how the three of you come together, and the way that you communicate your knowledge in such a way that has everyone in the room captivated. So please keep
cool. Thank
shining
you.
and doing the amazing work that you do. And
Appreciate it.
it's been a pleasure to have you on the Curious Collective.
Thank you, Katie. Really enjoyed it.
No worries. Katie out.